I told myself I didn't care, but standing there, watching her rearrange the stack of books with that faint, almost imperceptible sigh, I realized how hollow the words had been. I hadn't planned to notice her today, not really. But then she appeared, leaning slightly against the counter of the little bookstore tucked between the cafe and the dry cleaners, and something unsteady shifted in my chest. She moved with that effortless confidence that comes only with decades of knowing who you are. Mid-40s, maybe, but that made her seem even more composed, more grounded, like the kind of person who had walked through storms and carried the calm afterward. Her hair caught the morning light through the window, subtle waves, a touch of silver near the temples, not hidden but embraced. And her eyes, I swear, they were like she saw more than she let on. I fiddled with the strap of my bag, pretending to look for a book I didn't need. My voice stuck somewhere between my throat and the floor when she glanced at me. For a fraction of a second, our eyes met, and it was like stepping onto the edge of a cliff, thrilling and terrifying all at once. She didn't say anything, just tilted her head slightly, as if she already knew what I was thinking, and that made me panic internally while keeping my outward face neutral. "I've never seen you around here before," I managed to say finally, the words thinner than I wanted. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she set down the hardcover she'd been dusting and gave a faint, wry smile. "I wonder," she said. Simple, casual, and yet it wasn't casual at all. The way she spoke made it clear she'd noticed more than she let on. My awkward stance, the way my fingers had curled around the strap, the hesitant tilt of my head. I wanted to say something clever, something that would make her laugh, but my throat dried. So I just nodded, fumbling for anything else to say. She didn't rush me. She just went back to her task, and I felt ridiculous. Because somehow, in the silence, in the quiet scrape of her fingers against the spine of a book, my heart had started racing. Then, without warning, she handed me a small notebook I'd been eyeing, her fingers brushing mine. It was accidental, or maybe it wasn't, and the shock of that brief contact lingered longer than it should have. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, and I couldn't stop staring at the spot where her fingers had touched mine, replaying it over and over in my head like a scratched record. "Thanks," I said, finally, my voice low. "Don't mention it," she replied, her smile subtle, half teasing, half knowing, like she was holding a secret I wasn't allowed to touch. And then she turned back to her work, leaving me staring at the floor, trying not to imagine what it would feel like to trace that line of her hand again. I stepped away from the counter, told myself it was nothing, and walked toward the exit. But even as I left, even as the bell above the door chimed my departure, her presence clung to me. It wasn't just the brush of her fingers, or the faint scent of her perfume, or the way the sunlight caught her hair. It was something more. Something unspoken, electric, and entirely maddening. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. I hadn't planned to see her again so soon, but the universe seemed to have a sense of humor. The bookstore had that quiet hum of afternoon light filtering through dusty windows, the scent of old paper and polish mingling into something almost intoxicating. And there she was, perched on a stool behind the counter, flipping through invoices with a furrowed brow. "Hey," I said softly, careful not to startle her. She glanced up, eyes wary, and for a moment, I caught the tiniest quiver in her jaw. A hesitation, a pause that said more than any words could. "Oh, hey," she replied, voice light, guarded. I lingered near the shelf she had just been dusting, pretending to skim titles while watching the subtle rhythms of her movements. Her hands, elegant but worn, traced the edges of books as though each one demanded careful attention. There were faint lines at the corners of her eyes, small evidence of nights that had stretched longer than she probably wanted anyone to know. I noticed the way she let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, a release that was meant to be private, and I felt a strange, quiet pull. "Could you hold this while I check the barcode?" she asked, handing me a small stack of journals. There was something hesitant in her gesture, like she was testing whether I'd handle the small task without spilling into the quiet she guarded so fiercely. "Sure," I said, my hands brushing against hers again. Again brief, accidental, but each time sending a small spark up my arm. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away completely, just the faintest stiffening, as though she was remembering to maintain a boundary she had carefully drawn. We worked in silence, the kind of silence that speaks loudly if you know how to listen. I caught her laugh once, soft and low, when a page fell from the stack, and it was almost painful how human it sounded, real and unguarded for a split second. My heart tightened. She paused to sip from her mug, her eyes sliding over the counter with a tired, almost mournful glance. She didn't ask me anything, didn't comment on me noticing, but I did. I noticed the slight droop of her shoulders, the faint pink at the tips of her ears from the effort of keeping composed. "You've got a lot going on," I said quietly, almost without thinking. Her eyes flicked up, meeting mine for a fraction of a second, then she looked away. "It's nothing," she said, too quickly, too sharply for someone who truly meant it. I didn't press. I just handed her the last journal, and for a heartbeat, our fingers brushed again. The contact lingered longer than necessary, a subtle, unspoken acknowledgement. She smiled then, just barely, a ghost of something tender, and I felt a pull I couldn't name. Forbidden, maybe, or reckless, but magnetic. And as she turned back to her work, I realized I was holding my breath, watching her, caught between wanting to step closer and knowing I shouldn't. Her presence pressed against the edges of my thoughts, insistent and quiet, and for a moment, the world outside the bookstore didn't exist. I wanted to say something more, but instead, I stayed there, silently observing the woman who had already claimed my attention in ways I didn't understand, and I couldn't stop myself from hoping she noticed me too. The bookstore was nearly empty that evening, the last flicker of sunlight slanting through tall windows and turning dust motes into drifting gold. Rain had begun to tap softly against the glass outside, a rhythmic, steady insistence that somehow made the room feel smaller, more intimate. I was stacking returned books behind her, close enough to catch the faint scent of her shampoo, the subtle warmth of her presence pressing against me. "You're still here?" I asked, careful to keep my tone casual, though my pulse betrayed me. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned over the counter, adjusting the receipts with an almost imperceptible tremble in her fingers. "I lost track of time," she said finally, eyes averted. There was a weight in her words I couldn't place, something fragile, almost fragile enough to break if handled the wrong way. We fell into silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable, it was full. My hand hovered near hers, just inches away, and I wanted nothing more than to close the gap, but the rational part of me held back. I remembered the rules she'd never explicitly stated but clearly lived by: boundaries, caution, and emotional self-preservation she didn't waive easily. A sudden chime from her phone made her start, the screen lighting up with a name I didn't recognize. She glanced at it and sighed, muttering, "Not now," before silencing it and slipping it back into her bag. The interruption was small, ordinary, but it felt monumental. Reality, with all its rules and responsibilities, had intruded into our quiet little bubble, shoving me back into the edges of my own restraint. I wanted to say something reckless and honest. "You don't have to handle everything yourself," I almost whispered, but stopped. The words felt too loud in the stillness, too daring for a space that had never been meant for confessions. She looked up then, finally, our eyes locking for a heartbeat longer than either of us should have allowed. There was a question in hers, tentative, unspoken, but I couldn't read it fully, not yet. I wanted to, desperately, but the careful, measured part of me kept me in check. "You've been helping a lot today," she said finally, voice soft, but not directed at me exactly, more like a murmured acknowledgement of herself, of something she didn't want to name. I wanted to tell her it was no trouble, that I didn't mind, that everything I felt was right there, trembling and obvious, if only I dared to say it. But I didn't. Instead, I reached for the last stack of books she was organizing, brushing her hand lightly. An accidental touch, just the tips of our fingers, and her gaze flickered down, then up again, lingering. She swallowed, and I noticed the way her shoulders tensed, how quickly she regained composure. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating her face in sudden, harsh brilliance. I thought about leaning closer, about letting the moment decide for both of us. But the sound of the rain, the echo of the phone, the invisible walls she'd built, it all held me back. I stepped back slightly, pretending to straighten the shelves, but my eyes didn't leave her. She returned to her work, but the brief connection, the almost confession in our shared silence, hung between us like charged air before a storm. And as I left that night, the echo of her fingers brushing mine refused to fade. It was close, so close. I found her sitting at the corner table in the cafe across the street from the bookstore, her laptop open, but her eyes somewhere else entirely. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, tapping lightly against the window, and the warm amber light of the cafe seemed too intimate for what I felt, too exposing, like it could highlight every unspoken thing between us. I slid into the seat across from her. She didn't look up immediately, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as though typing were an excuse to keep from speaking. I waited, heart hammering quietly in the background, aware that even breathing might feel too loud. Finally, she glanced at me. "You keep showing up," she said softly, almost accusatory, almost a question, and yet entirely neither. I started, then stopped. Words felt clumsy, inadequate. I don't know. I guess I trailed off, unsure if she even wanted me to finish the sentence. She laughed quietly, a sound with a rough edge, and shook her head. "You're ridiculous," she said, though the softness in her tone betrayed the hardness in her words. She leaned back, running a hand over her face. "I don't even know why I let you stay so close." I watched her, taking in the subtle fatigue etched into her features, the fine lines around her eyes, the slight slump of her shoulders, the way her lips trembled just enough to betray some private hesitation. I wanted to reach across the table, to steady her, to make it all easier somehow, but the unspoken rules between us screamed against it. "Are you happy?" I asked quietly, careful, not asking about me, about us, but about her. About this life she carried on her own. Her eyes flickered to mine, holding mine for a long moment that made me feel like I was trespassing. Then she exhaled slowly. "I don't know anymore," she admitted. The words fell, heavy, almost broken. "I've been pretending that everything's fine, that I'm fine, but I can't anymore. And now there's you." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pressed down, thick and dense, making the air between us impossible to ignore. I wanted to say something comforting, something decisive, something that would make her pain smaller, but I couldn't. I only watched. Her hand trembled slightly as she closed her laptop, and for the first time, she looked vulnerable in a way that wasn't performative. She wasn't poised. She wasn't composed. She was just her, and it shook me in ways I hadn't anticipated. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered finally, almost to herself, almost pleading, almost a confession. "And I don't want to hurt anyone. I don't want to ruin everything." The words hung in the air, and I felt them like a weight pressing against my chest. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that whatever this was didn't have to be perfect, didn't have to be defined, but I knew that saying it aloud would change everything. So I said nothing. I just leaned back, keeping my gaze on her, letting the silence do what words couldn't. And then, finally, with a voice so soft I had to strain to hear it over the cafe's quiet hum, she said, "I don't even know if I can trust myself not to." Her sentence broke off, unfinished, but the tremor in her voice said everything. I sat there, heart caught in my throat, aware that this moment, the vulnerability, the honesty, would follow me far beyond this table, far beyond this rainy afternoon. Because she had just let me see her fracture. I didn't expect her to share anything personal that afternoon, not in the way she did. We were sorting through a box of returned books in the back storage room of the bookstore, the overhead light buzzing softly, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. She handed me a worn paperback, then paused, glancing over her shoulder as if weighing whether she should speak. I used to come here when I was younger," she said, voice low, almost fragile. Before things went sideways." Her fingers brushed the spine of a book as though holding on to it grounded her. I nodded, not wanting to press too hard, but my curiosity, quiet, restrained, was already stirring. Lost someone, she continued, a faint hitch in her breath. It's stupid, really. He was everything, and I thought I had time to fix things. But then life happened, and I didn't. Her hands clenched briefly, and I noticed the tremor, the tiny exhale that came out through her nose instead of her mouth. A subtle sign she was holding back more than she said. I wanted to say something that would ease her, to tell her it wasn't stupid, that everyone carries these ghosts, but all I managed was a soft, "I'm sorry." Too simple, too small, and yet it was all I could manage in the moment. She shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible laugh escaping her. "You wouldn't understand," she murmured. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "But you remind me of him, in a way." The words hit me like a quiet tremor under my ribs. Not a dramatic earthquake, just a subtle shift in gravity that made my heart lurch and my hands go cold. Remind her of someone she had lost, someone irreplaceable, and yet she kept looking at me, not turning away, not shielding herself. I swallowed, unsure what to say. I wanted to reach for her hand, but didn't, respecting the fragile tension she had let me glimpse. "I don't know what to say," I admitted quietly. I don't want to be a replacement." She gave a faint smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes entirely, a mix of gratitude and apology. "You're not," she said softly. "Not even close. But you make it harder to forget. And maybe that's unfair." Her fingers brushed the edge of another book, the movement so slight, so human, that I felt the weight of everything she hadn't said. For a long moment, we just stood there in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the rustle of paper. I realized I was holding my breath, not sure if exhaling would break some unspoken boundary she'd allowed me to approach. Then she shifted, finally, and for the briefest instant, our fingers touched, intentional, hesitant, electric. Not a kiss, not a declaration, just a touch. And it felt like the room itself had tilted, the quiet weight of the afternoon pulling at my chest. She looked up at me then, eyes vulnerable, and whispered, almost to herself, "I don't know how to feel anymore." And in that moment, I knew she had given me a piece of herself she hadn't shared with anyone in years, and I didn't dare let go, not yet. The rain had stopped by the time I found myself walking beside her on the narrow street behind the bookstore. Puddles reflected the dim glow of street lamps, and the air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and something warmer, her coat, maybe, or the faint trace of her perfume lingering just enough to make me notice. We didn't speak at first. There was no need. The space between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was patient, familiar in a way that had taken months to build. I noticed the way her hands brushed together nervously, how she kept glancing at the worn sneakers I had on, as if that mattered. Finally, she stopped at a corner, tilting her head up slightly toward me. I've been thinking," she said, voice quiet but steady. "About all of this, about you, about me, about how we can't pretend it's nothing anymore." I nodded, careful not to interrupt, careful not to say too much. The truth was clear in the silence, in the small, deliberate movements we allowed ourselves. Her hand brushing against the strap of my bag, my fingers lingering a second longer than they needed to when I handed her a book I had bought for her. "I don't want to rush anything," she continued, eyes fixed somewhere between the street and the lamplight. I want to be honest. About how I feel, about how I've let myself feel." Her voice cracked slightly, not in despair, but in the weight of her admission. I reached out instinctively, letting my fingers lightly touch hers. The gesture was so small, so quiet, but it carried the years of restraint, hesitation, and stolen glances that had led to this moment. She didn't pull away. "I don't know what comes next," I whispered, though it wasn't really a question. "But I want to be here, with you, in whatever way we can manage." She tilted her head, just enough for our foreheads to almost touch. The faint warmth of her skin, the subtle rhythm of her breath, it was enough. Not a promise, not a declaration, just acknowledgement that the distance, the fear, the hesitation, all of it, had dissolved into something real and mutual. We walked a few more steps, hands brushing together occasionally, letting the rhythm of our steps and the quiet street speak the words neither of us needed to say. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't some grand moment of fireworks. But it was ours, and it was earned. When we paused in front of her apartment, I finally let our hands rest fully together. No sudden movements. No dramatic gestures. Just fingers laced, bodies close, breathing synchronized. It was intimate because it was real. She looked at me once, eyes soft but steady, and whispered, almost to herself, "I guess this is where we start." I nodded, squeezing her hand lightly, feeling the weight and the gravity of everything we hadn't said, everything we had felt, settle quietly around us. And in that simple, unremarkable gesture, I realized I had already fallen, not in a fairy tale way, but in a way that mattered. Real, earned, unavoidable. We lingered there, silent, together, letting the world fade around us. I never expected a quiet Tuesday afternoon to become the kind of memory that lingers. Sitting here now, months later, I can still feel the weight of that first real touch. Her hand brushing against mine, fingers lacing, no grand words, just presence. It's strange how something so simple can change everything. She's changed too, I think. Not drastically, not in ways the world would notice, but in the little things. Her smile lingers longer, softer, like she's finally letting herself feel what she'd kept locked away. And sometimes, when she laughs, it's not just polite. It's full and real, and I swear I can hear the echoes of every quiet, hesitant conversation we almost had before. For me, I've learned how patient desire can be, how connection doesn't need to be explosive to be undeniable. I've learned to read silences, to listen for what's unspoken, to let someone exist fully without rushing toward conclusions or confessions. Love, I've realized, isn't always about fireworks. Sometimes it's about the small constellations, the fleeting glances, the shared coffee on rainy mornings, the way a hand lingers on another's for no reason at all. Those moments are quiet, but they resonate far deeper than anything shouted. We still navigate this carefully, still tiptoe around boundaries and unspoken histories. And that's okay. It's ours. Slow, flawed, imperfect, and entirely ours. I catch myself smiling at nothing, replaying a glance, a brush of fingers, a soft, I don't know how to feel anymore, that once made my chest tighten. The world outside continues, indifferent. But inside these small shared spaces, inside these ordinary days, something extraordinary has settled. Not because it's perfect, but because it's real. Sometimes, when I pass that bookstore or see her settling books just so, I remember how we got here, through hesitation, longing, small vulnerabilities, and quiet persistence. And I think, maybe this is what love really is. I don't know what comes next, and I don't want to define it with grand gestures or promises. I just want to keep showing up, to keep noticing, to keep feeling this, without labels, without rush. And maybe that's enough. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?